We all, like everybody else, sat glued to the television the night that the plane brought you kids out of Vietnam and watched you all come off the plane in Vancouver, but also heard the announcement that don't anyone respond to these children because they have all been matched with families. These children are all going to families that they've been matched with. So, we watched it with interest. And then we got a call on Thursday from the children saying, would you be interested in one of the children from Vietnam?
I was born in Vietnam in 1973, and by 1975 I ended up in an orphanage in the city of Saigon.
And I don't have any memories of being in Vietnam or know the language, because at that time I was only 5 months old.
My records of Vietnam, I strongly believe, do not exist. I think they're up in smoke with the rest of the country.
When you think of what we were supposed to do in Saigon, we didn't really normally know.
At that time, they were starting what was called Operation Baby Lift. And this was a mass evacuation of war orphans from Vietnam to different parts of the world, including Australia, France, UK, United States, and Canada.
These children are among an estimated 2 million refugees in South Vietnam. But they are more than mere statistics. They are the flesh and blood reality of a terrible war. And they are the concern of a news conference taking place thousands of miles away in Canada.
These inquiries indicated that some Ontario couples have a strong desire to adopt Vietnamese children and to bring them to this province where they can share in the good life most of us take for granted.
I was authorized to fly a flight into Saigon. We didn't know what we were going to get. The one, though, with the orphans, we were expecting. And it was a very hot day, about 95 degrees. And I asked the co-pilot to go in and file a flight plan for us to get back to Hong Kong. I waited by the aircraft, and these vehicles were carrying all these babies. The crewman who operates at the back of the aircraft, he was overseeing loading these children and these babies. The Viet Cong weren't very far away. 4 Vietnamese military personnel came on the aircraft, and they had machine guns, and they wanted to check the manifest of these babies to see that we had the same number of children. One of the ladies who was accompanying the babies came up, and I was sitting in the cockpit, and she said, "These guards have said there's 2 more babies on board than we have names on the manifest, so they're going to take 2 off." And she said, "They'll do that over my dead body."
Yeah, looks good, sir.
Helen Allen and Vicki Leach, the 2 ladies who brought us out, they had made several trips to Vietnam before ours. So they'd been there taking kids out long before us. When they boarded the kids on that plane, there was so much chaos. You have to remember it was exactly 2 weeks before Saigon fell.
When we were there, although the war was supposed to have ended, it really wasn't over at all, because every night we heard shelling, sometimes as close as 4 miles away. And the Canadians who were there with the ICCS at the time were very kind to us and very helpful, and also very firm in their advice that we should not leave the city. And it wasn't very tempting to leave the city when you were hearing guns so close.
In the orphanages we visited, we found that there were 25,000 orphans living in orphanages. And even these are not all total orphans, because occasionally they're put in an orphanage for economic reasons only. The family simply cannot provide enough food for 1 more child, so temporarily he may be put in an orphanage.
So I was selected because there was no trace of family. And so I was put onto the plane with 56, we think around 56 other babies. We were transported on a Hercules C-130 plane. And when they got to the airport, They looked inside the plane and all they saw were cardboard boxes, banana boxes, and orange crates. And the care workers said, what are we going to do with the boxes? And the pilot said, well, it's the only way we could think of transporting these children.
To describe what the back of that aircraft was like, I would say at least 40 of the babies were in cardboard boxes, maybe more, probably 50. And then the older ones were, I would think, up to the age of maybe perhaps 8, but maybe 5, 6. There were some older children. And what I still remember very clearly is the look of kind of wonderment on their eyes. They didn't know where they were going, and I'm sure none of them had flown in an aircraft before. Not one was crying of the older children. They were just standing, silently watching what was going on.
The ministry over there, incidentally, was delighted that a government here was reaching out. It's the first time that there had been government representatives approach the ministry there. And they have been inundated with letters from people who really want to adopt a child, and they really didn't know how to deal with it. So they were very, very pleased that our government was reaching out and trying to assist them in this way.
So we were not a organized flight. We were not a pre-adopted flight, meaning flights before us, the adopted parents had to pay for these kids. Our flight was the last official flight out of Vietnam.
I was sick along the flight to Toronto.
It turned out we were quite ill. A lot of us had diseases and malnourishment and dehydration or all the above. So not all of us could carry on to Canada from Hong Kong. A few of them had to stay behind.
And then I believe there was a couple of the little babies that were with me in Hong Kong that didn't make it out.
And so the rest of us continued on to Toronto, and when we got into Toronto, they put us onto a bus, and then we were carted to a place called One Surrey Place Center. And actually some of the children didn't even make it to Surrey Place Center. They were sent directly to Sick Kids Hospital because they were so sick. And so it was at Surrey Place Center that the Canadian families who had agreed to adopt us actually came to meet us for the first time. And so that's how we started our life in Canada.
My age of arrival in Canada was about 2.5 years old. My birth records, I have none. I have 0 records. To even come up with the age about 2.5 of when I came, again, was a guess through bone x-rays and any other tests they do to get an idea of how old I was. It was difficult to determine that because we were so malnourished. I wasn't fully developed to where I should have been. My parents were very, child-oriented. My mom loved kids, especially babies. She still does. They were definitely there to help me along the way. I guess the most shocking thing was to find out that not all of us were adopted into happy families.
They've had a number of people from all parts of the world on sort of foraging expeditions in South Vietnam looking for children. And they've felt they must clamp down on this and sort of legitimize the adoption procedure, which was really getting out of hand with children leaving the country who perhaps had natural parents, and the parents would turn up looking for their child and find that he'd been adopted in Europe or North America or someplace.
I actually had parents who were looking for me because I was mistakenly taken from an orphanage that they had put me in for safekeeping. They had 2 older boys, and they had put them in the care of these Catholic nuns in a village outside of Saigon, near the coast. It was more of a boarding school situation for them. They would come back and they would serve in the army and during the war, and then they would come back and visit on weekends. parents and see their children. When the war escalated to a point that they could no longer come back to visit, they were just too busy, it was during that time that Operation Baby Lift had started to commence. And so soldiers were coming by these kind of outlying areas and bringing children closer to the city, into the main part where this one GoVap orphanage was, taking the majority of these children. And so by the time I was taken and brought to GoVap, there was no trace of my family. And at the end of the war, April 30th, 1975, these parents come back looking for their 3 children, and the baby is missing. And that's when the search began. And they kept on going to orphanage to orphanage. Where did they go? Where did they go? And all they could say was, to America, to America. So they all thought that all of the kids went to the United States. They never thought of looking in Canada or any of the other countries.
I don't know who to relate to in the Vietnamese way right now. I was raised in Canada since 5 months old, and my parents didn't try to influence me to learn the language, or they don't like cook the Vietnamese traditional way. They just do the Canadian. As far as the history of Vietnam, there wasn't much that I learned from school. I believe we did a lot of American history. My parents may have touched on it a bit. I didn't really research on it myself. I just accepted, here I am, I'm in Canada, I'm Canadian, and I was happy with that.
My travel mates of 1975 became a mission for me in 2005. Back in 2003, I had met a fellow travel mate of mine by chance. My former boss of Sarnia, who I'd worked for in construction, was at church one Sunday, and they had a guest speaker at that church who had introduced himself of who he was and where he was from. So my boss, knowing my story, approached me at work the next day and said, we had a speaker yesterday who sounded a lot like you. I have his contact. I'll give you his card, and maybe you should give him a call. And so that was a Monday, and it took me till Friday to get the nerve to call him, because I thought there's 30 million people in Canada and there was only 57 of us on that plane, so the chances were pretty nil.
I get this call. Hi, my name is Trent Kilner. I live in Sarnia, Ontario, and I was on the same plane as you. And immediately I had to ask, how do you know? And he said, well, Victoria Leach and Helen Allen, they flew us out from Saigon, Saigon to Hong Kong, Hong Kong to Vancouver, Vancouver to Toronto, and we ended up at Surrey Place Centre. So all the right names in all the right places.
And as soon as those 2 names came up in our conversation, we knew we were on that same plane.
That was amazing to me. 30 odd years later, actually meeting Trent and getting to see that we had these similar stories of starting our lives in Canada, and very similar families too, which is interesting.
So that was in 03. In 05, we finally got the ball rolling and decided, you know what, we can find each other. Let's see if we can find the other 55. So with the help of the media, they took off with our story, and we had set up an email account on the internet to let people know we were looking for them. And we probably had about 25 hits in the first week of fellow travel mates of ours. So from 2005 to 2006, we ended up with probably over 40, which included some deceased, because not all of them made it. But we were able to track down those who had died as well.
I was doing home nursing at that time, and one of my clients gave me the standard, and it had it right up on Trent and Tawn looking for other orphans. So I did take the news article home to my mom and dad and had them read it just to make sure it was the right one, and my mom confirmed that was the right flight that I was on as well. So I read the write-up, and I just waited for a little while. I didn't rush it, and then I just finally decided to send an email off to Trent, and then we made arrangements to meet.
She was one of the first ones to contact us through the emails in 05 when we were doing the search. So we had set up an appointment to meet in downtown Toronto and just talk about our past. And I was excited to see what kind of paper she had, which turned out to be no more than I had.
So I actually had some documents. One was an actual birth certificate in Vietnamese, and then the other one was a government-issued translation, so I knew the names. plus some other, smaller papers through the adoption agency that my parents held on to. So I probably had the most documentation and, records than any of the children that came with me.
So we had a big reunion in Oakville in 2006.
And we met with about 260 people, parents of the families, brothers, sisters. We met the pilots, we met the doctors and nurses. We met Victoria Leach and Helen Allen, who headed up the trip. So it was phenomenal, really, to have that kind of reunion after so many years. And then that story actually went around the world in the media, global media, made it to the French consulate newsletter. And then it made it to the Vietnamese newspapers. So I got an email from this gentleman in Saigon saying, okay, well, these are my parents' names, and we're looking for a brother that went missing in 1975, and he was part of the Operation Baby Lift. And, that set me off right there. But then I went to these papers that came with me, right? And I looked at the names, and they matched the names of this, gentleman's email. And I'm like, what's going on? And so I said I needed more information. So they sent a photocopy of an actual birth certificate that they had kept. And I looked at my original, and I looked at theirs, and it was an exact duplicate.
My wife today, I met May 7th, 2005. I was very interested in her when I first met her.
So for Trent and I to meet and actually end up together was pretty cool. I don't think anyone else in the group had that.
My family consists of my wife, my 2 boys, Trevor, who is 2.5, Brandon, who is 4.5, and my daughter, Maddie, who is 6.5.
Our physical family tree does start here with Trent and I from my kids. But yeah, through adoption, they still have grandparents and cousins and so on that may not look physically like them, but we're still family as well.
The curiosity of my kids of their mom and dad has become an interest for my daughter. She has asked a couple questions. She asked, why isn't grandma and grandpa the same color as you?
When you take a child out of their context, well, what are they losing? They're losing their culture, they're losing their language, they're losing their customs, and they get absorbed and reinculturated into wherever they are brought. That's now the life, the culture that they are going to be brought up in and used to. And so those are the eyes that they're going to be seeing the world through as well. And so, to say that I haven't brought up into a kind of what I would call a Western Caucasian world, and that's how I live my life and I see life, that's true. But do I regret that, or do I feel cheated about that? Personally, I don't. Personally, I really do and am grateful for the life that I have here in Canada. The family that I was brought into, the Campbell family, treated me like their own.
As far as Vietnamese culture, tradition, interests, I personally haven't taken it upon myself to really involve or try to ask the kids if they're interested in that. Maybe I should.
A trip back to Vietnam, it would be a lot more significant though because of my wife and my kids. We, my wife being part of the group and one of my travel mates. With our kids, it'd be a very meaningful trip to go back together as our family. Our bloodline, we don't have a family blood tree. Our kids are it. They are the tree.